Isolation in the wild can be both peaceful and perilous. The solitude offers quiet and reflection, but it also leaves you vulnerable. When you're alone, every sound feels sharper, every shadow darker, and help can be miles or hours away. The wilderness doesn't forgive carelessness, and unseen dangers lurk everywhere. Unstable terrain, hidden predators, or even your own mind playing tricks in the silence. Staying mindful of your surroundings isn't just smart, it's survival. Trust your instincts, know your limits, and never underestimate the wild's ability to turn isolation into something truly terrifying. Out here, you're never as alone as you think. It was Danny's idea, as usual. "Come on," he said, flashing his cocky grin. "It'll be fun. A few drinks, a scary story, and some good laughs. What's the worst that could happen?" The worst, as it turned out, was a lot. The group of 4 college friends, Danny, Rachel, Mike, and Jess, had been roommates since freshman year. Now seniors, they were looking for ways to spice up their final months on campus, and Danny's suggestion to visit the haunted cornfield fit the bill. The field lay on the outskirts of town, shrouded in local legend. The story went that decades ago, an old farmer named Edgar Rook lived there with his family. After a particularly poor harvest, Edgar spiraled into madness. One night, he murdered his wife and 3 children, setting the cornfield ablaze before hanging himself from the charred remains of the barn. Locals swore the field was cursed, crops wouldn't grow, and anyone who ventured too close at night heard whispers, screams, or worse. Most stayed away. But for Danny, that was all part of the fun. The group piled into Mike's beat-up sedan, the trunk loaded with blankets, snacks, and a bottle of cheap whiskey. The drive to the cornfield took them down winding back roads, the night growing darker with each passing mile. "You guys are seriously freaked out by this?" Danny teased, turning in his seat to smirk at Jess and Rachel in the back. "It's not freaky, it's just stupid," Rachel shot back, though her clenched jaw betrayed her nerves. "I think it's cool," Jess said, staring out the window. "I mean, it's creepy, but that's the point, right?" Mike stayed quiet, gripping the wheel tightly. He'd grown up in the area and had heard the stories his whole life. He didn't believe in ghosts, but something about the field always made him uneasy. They arrived at the cornfield just before midnight. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of tall, withered stalks. The field was overgrown, the air thick with the scent of decay. "Let's set up over there," Danny said, pointing to a clearing near a dilapidated scarecrow. Its straw-stuffed head slumped to one side, the burlap face crudely stitched into an eerie grin. As they spread out their blankets and opened the whiskey, Danny launched into the tale of Edgar Rook. "So," he began, taking a swig, "the story goes that after killing his family, Edgar tied himself to that scarecrow post over there and set himself on fire." "Why the scarecrow?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who knows?" Danny shrugged. "Maybe he thought he'd scare away the crows, or the townsfolk." "That's dumb," Rachel muttered, pulling her blanket tighter. Danny ignored her, leaning in closer. "But here's the kicker. People say he still walks the field at night, searching for trespassers to finish what he started." Mike rolled his eyes. "Cut it out, Danny." "Oh, come on, man. It's just a story." The group settled into uneasy laughter, the whiskey doing little to calm their nerves. The night stretched on, the air growing colder. The wind whispered through the corn, carrying sounds that could have been anything, crickets rustling leaves or something else. "Did you hear that?" Jess asked suddenly, sitting up straight. "Hear what?" Danny asked, though his grin faltered. "It sounded like a scream," she said, her eyes darting toward the stalks. "You're imagining things," Rachel said, though she refused to look. The group fell silent, the wind picking up, carrying the scent of smoke. "Do you smell that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "Maybe someone's burning leaves," Danny said, though he didn't sound convinced. Jess pointed toward the edge of the field. "There." In the distance, a faint orange glow flickered between the stalks, growing brighter with each passing second. "What the hell is that?" Mike asked, his voice rising. Danny grabbed the flashlight and stood. "It's probably just some kids screwing around. Stay here. I'll check it out." "Are you insane?" Rachel hissed, grabbing his arm. But Danny shrugged her off. "I'll be fine." The others watched as Danny disappeared into the cornfield, the flashlight beam bobbing as he moved further away. The glow in the distance seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat. "I don't like this," Jess whispered. "Me neither," Mike agreed, his fists clenched. Minutes passed, the tension thick. Then abruptly the glow vanished, plunging the field into darkness. "Danny?" Rachel called, her voice trembling. No answer. The flashlight beam reappeared, but it was moving erratically, whipping back and forth. A blood-curdling scream tore through the night. "Run!" Danny shouted, his voice raw with terror. He burst through the stalks, tripping over himself as he reached the group. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Mike demanded. "There's something out there," Danny gasped, pointing toward the field. Before anyone could respond, the corn parted, and a figure emerged. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was blackened and cracked, his clothes hanging in scorched tatters. His eyes glowed like embers, and his twisted grin mirrored the scarecrow's. "Who dares disturb my field?" the figure growled, his voice like crackling fire. The group froze, paralyzed by fear. The figure stepped closer, the ground beneath him smoldering with every step. "Run!" Mike shouted, grabbing Jess's hand. They scattered, the field swallowing them one by one. Maggie sprinted through the stalks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rustling behind her grew louder, closer. She turned a corner and tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Looking up, she saw the scarecrow looming above her, its head now twisted to face her. "Help me!" she whimpered, but the darkness closed in. When the sun rose, the field was quiet. The car sat empty at the edge of the field, its headlights still on. The townsfolk found no trace of the college kids, save for the scarecrow. Its grin was wider now, and its burlap head smelled faintly of smoke. Tom hadn't planned to drive so late, but work had kept him longer than expected. The stretch of road he was on was lonely, winding through endless countryside. The occasional streetlight punctuated the darkness, but mostly, the world around him was swallowed by shadows. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:47 p.m. He'd promised his mother he'd be there by midnight, but at this rate, he'd be late. The road seemed endless, flanked by towering stalks of corn that swayed in the breeze. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, pulling the car to the side of the road. He turned the key, but the engine refused to start. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he stepped out, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The road was desolate, no sign of another car for miles. His cell phone was no help either, no signal. The only light came from a small, distant glow beyond the cornfield. A farmhouse, perhaps. With no other choice, Tom grabbed a flashlight from his glove box and started toward the light. The cornfield was dense, the stalks towering over him, their dry leaves rustling with every step he took. The narrow dirt path winding through the corn seemed purposeful, but as he walked, the air grew heavier, the silence deeper. The first strange sound came about 10 minutes in. It was faint at first, almost like whispering, carried on the breeze. He stopped, shining his flashlight into the rows of corn. The beam sliced through the darkness, but revealed nothing but stalks swaying gently. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small and uncertain. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. Tom shook his head, muttering to himself, "Get a grip. Just the wind." He continued walking, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. As he pressed on, the path seemed to twist unnaturally, leading him deeper into the field. The light from the farmhouse seemed no closer, and the corn pressed in around him, the rows impossibly tight. Another sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. Tom froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned the flashlight toward the sound. The beam wavered, illuminating the endless rows of corn. Something moved. It was quick, darting between the stalks, too fast for him to make out. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice breaking. There was no response, just the rustling of corn. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and growing into a cacophony of unintelligible voices. Tom's hands shook as he swept the flashlight back and forth. The beam caught something, a glimpse of a figure tall and impossibly thin, standing motionless among the stalks. "Hey!" Tom called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Summoning what courage he could, Tom stepped closer, the beam of light steadying on the figure. It was a scarecrow. Its burlap face was crudely stitched, its grin jagged and wide. The straw-stuffed body was slumped, arms outstretched as if in mock crucifixion. Tom exhaled, relief washing over him. "Just a damn scarecrow," he muttered. But as he turned away, he swore he heard it whisper his name. The path grew narrower, the corn closing in around him. The farmhouse light seemed impossibly far now, flickering like a dying flame. Tom's flashlight flickered too, the beam growing dimmer. "Come on," he muttered, smacking it against his palm. The light died completely, plunging him into darkness. Panic set in as the whispers returned, louder and closer. They seemed to come from all directions, circling him, pressing against his ears. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. Then from the darkness came a voice. "Why are you here?" Tom spun around, his eyes straining against the dark. The voice was low, almost a growl, and impossibly close. I'm just passing through," he stammered, backing away. The corn rustled violently, the stalks parting as a figure emerged. It wasn't the scarecrow, but it was just as unnatural. The man, or what looked like a man, was tall and gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "This is my field," the figure said, its voice echoing unnaturally. Tom stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. "I'm just trying to get to the farmhouse." The figure's smile widened. "There is no farmhouse." The light in the distance winked out, leaving Tom alone with the figure. Tom turned and ran, crashing through the corn, the dry stalks cutting at his skin. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping into a deafening roar. "Leave!" they screamed. "You don't belong here!" He tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. Scrambling to his feet, he glanced back and saw them, figures emerging from the corn, dozens of them. They were all like the first, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their smiles wide and unnatural. He ran blindly, the rows of corn blurring together. His chest burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. The cornfield seemed endless, the path twisting and turning with no rhyme or reason. He could feel them closing in, their cold breath on his neck. Finally, Tom burst into a clearing, collapsing onto the ground. He gasped for air, his body trembling. The clearing was eerily silent, the whispers gone. Slowly he looked up and froze. In the center of the clearing stood the scarecrow. Its head was tilted to one side, its grin wider than before. As Tom watched, the scarecrow moved. Its straw-filled arms creaked as they reached out toward him, and its stitched eyes seemed to come alive, glowing faintly in the darkness. "No," Tom whispered, scrambling back. "This isn't real." But the scarecrow stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers returned louder than ever, drowning out his screams. The next morning, Tom's car was found abandoned by the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, the keys still in the ignition. A search party combed the cornfield, but there was no sign of him. The only thing they found was the scarecrow, its burlap face twisted into a grin that seemed wider than before. And from deep within the cornfield, if you listened closely, you could hear the whispers calling his name. The Miller family's farm sprawled across acres of rolling hills, the land dotted with a weathered barn, a modest farmhouse, and endless rows of corn stretching to the horizon. To outsiders, it was picturesque, but to the Miller children, Jacob, 14, and his sister Emma, 10, the farm held a darker secret. Their father had always been clear. "Stay out of the cornfield. You don't go past the third row, no matter what." "Why?" Emma had asked once, her big brown eyes wide with curiosity. "Because it's haunted," their father replied curtly, his gaze hard and unyielding. "There's a scarecrow in there, and it doesn't like trespassers." Jacob had scoffed, but the warning wasn't lost on him. Their father's tone carried a weight that left no room for argument. For years, the warning was enough. The children avoided the cornfield, entertaining themselves around the barn and by the creek. But one humid summer evening, curiosity got the better of them. "Let's go see it," Jacob said, his voice low and conspiratorial as they sat on the porch steps. Emma hesitated. "Dad said—" "Dad's not here," Jacob interrupted. "He's at the market, and Mom's busy with dinner. We'll just peek. Come on." Reluctantly, Emma followed her brother. The cornfield loomed before them, the stalks swaying gently in the breeze, their rustling like whispers. The third row marked the boundary, its stalks taller and denser than those closer to the house. As they stepped between the rows, the air seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of the farm fading behind them. "See? Nothing to be scared of," Jacob said, trying to mask his own unease. Then they saw it. The scarecrow stood in the middle of a small clearing, its tattered clothes fluttering in the wind. Its head was a burlap sack, crudely stitched with black thread to form a jagged, grinning face. A wide-brimmed hat sat crookedly on its head, and its arms stretched out unnaturally long, as if reaching for something. Emma shivered. "It's creepy." Jacob laughed nervously. "It's just a stupid scarecrow. Come on, let's get closer." As they approached, Emma froze. "Did it just move?" Jacob turned to her, annoyed. "No, it didn't. You're just scared." But as he turned back to the scarecrow, his bravado faltered. The grin stitched onto its face seemed wider than before, the black threaded eyes staring straight at them. A low sound reached their ears, a faint rustling, not caused by the wind. Jacob spun around, his heart hammering. "Hello?" No one answered, but the rustling grew louder, closer. "We should go," Emma whispered, tugging on Jacob's sleeve. Before he could respond, a figure burst through the corn behind them. It wasn't a scarecrow, it was a man, tall and wiry, with wild eyes and clothes caked in dirt. His face was gaunt, his grin crooked and sinister. In his hand, he held a rusted scythe that gleamed in the fading light. "Lost, are we?" the man drawled, his voice a low rasp. Jacob stepped in front of Emma, his body rigid with fear. "Well, we were just leaving." The man's grin widened. "Oh, you're not going anywhere." He lunged. Jacob grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her as they sprinted back toward the house. The cornfield seemed endless, the rows blending together as the man's laughter echoed behind them. "Run faster!" Jacob shouted, his lungs burning. Emma tripped, her small body hitting the dirt hard. Jacob skidded to a stop, helping her to her feet as the man's shadow loomed closer. "You can't hide," the man sang, the scythe glinting as he swung it lazily through the stalks. Jacob yanked Emma forward, adrenaline fueling their desperate escape. Finally, the edge of the cornfield came into view, the silhouette of the barn a beacon of hope. They burst out of the cornfield and into the barn, slamming the heavy door shut behind them. Jacob slid a wooden beam across the door, locking it in place. "Are you okay?" he panted, turning to Emma. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Outside, the man's footsteps crunched on the gravel. "I know you're in there," he called, his voice sing-song. "You think you're safe?" Jacob grabbed a pitchfork, his hands trembling. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Emma. The barn door rattled as the man banged on it. "Open up, kids. Let's have some fun." The door creaked, the beam bending under the man's weight. A loud crash echoed through the barn as the man kicked the door open, his wild eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Jacob raised the pitchfork, his heart pounding. "Stay back." The man laughed, a guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. "What are you going to do with that, boy?" He stepped closer, the scythe gleaming. Desperation took over. Jacob charged, swinging the pitchfork with all his strength. The man dodged easily, grabbing the weapon and hurling it across the barn. Jacob stumbled back, shielding Emma as the man advanced. The man raised the scythe, but before he could strike, a deafening gunshot rang out. The man froze, his wild eyes widening in shock. Blood blossomed on his chest as he staggered backward, collapsing onto the barn floor. Jacob and Emma turned to see their father standing in the doorway, a shotgun in his hands, his face pale but determined. "Are you kids okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. They nodded, tears streaming down their faces as they ran to him. The police arrived soon after, their flashing lights illuminating the darkened farm. The man was identified as a drifter who had been living in the abandoned farmhouse miles away. He had been hunting in the area, using the cornfield as his hunting ground, targeting anyone who strayed too close. The scarecrow, it turned out, was his creation, a twisted warning to anyone who dared to enter. That night, as Jacob and Emma huddled together in the safety of their home, their father sat silently by the window, his shotgun resting against the wall. The cornfield swayed gently in the breeze, its secrets buried once more.